Hi, everybody, and welcome to the seventh module in Journalism 101, Critical Analysis of the Mass Media, the online version. I'm your instructor, Paul Trout. Welcome back. This chapter talks about networking and digital distribution. There's a lot of meaty material in this chapter, and you're going to read about a lot of different things, both historical and contemporary, in terms of technological developments and the implications for that type of thing. I just want to provide some very, very broad brushstrokes in terms of some of the things I think are noteworthy in this chapter as you move on into actually reading this content. So let's move on into just a single panel, a short video, where I want to talk about a few things. One of the things that mass communication theorists have talked about for a long time is how, with the advancement of each individual method of networking and transmitting information over long distances, that time and space were affected. And there's a great deal that's written about this by media historians for things like the telegraph or the telephone, and increasingly so in terms of networking for things like television networks with microwave relay systems utilized by leases from American Telephone and Telegraph, and even more recently in terms of things like satellite technology and now, of course, the internet. And I'll just give you one example of the things that you may want to ponder as you read about this kind of notion. With the advent of the telegraph that reached, if you will, from the East Coast to the West Coast, think about the implications that had in terms of, one, speeding up the time for communication. In the old days, someone could write a letter, and if the horseback rider wasn't waylaid by storms, weather, floods, it could take that letter 7 to 10 days to get across America. Think about the fact that with telegraphy, all of a sudden you could transmit a message from New York to San Francisco in a very, very short period of time, a matter of seconds. All of a sudden, that made things like what was happening on the West Coast relevant to what was happening on the East Coast. So all of a sudden, things like trade and commerce or the price of goods and services coming into San Francisco ports could have bearing on things like New York markets. So commerce expanded, it sped up the transfer and currency of information, and in some ways shrunk the distance between things like markets. It also opened up the notion of fiscal markets to include something other than what was physically reachable within one day. This is something that we now take for granted in terms of things like international banking, but we didn't always have that. We have international banking today because of communication networks. So this whole interesting notion of time and space getting compressed as a function of advancing in faster and faster technologies that include networking technologies is something that's really important to consider, particularly for future job interests that you may have. You'll read about how we've gone from physical wire to fiber optic technology to wireless technology. I remember even recently in the last 15 years how living in Las Vegas, it was announced that Cox Communications, initially owned by the Greenspan family and known as Prime Cable in this market, they spent a lot of money to retrofit and build out their network so that it went from fiber from the central distribution points essentially out into neighborhood nodes. After that, it's a matter of coaxial cable. But there was a reason that they were advertising and promoting their high-speed fiber networks. And it wasn't just because they wanted to deliver broader band technology, HD programming to your households and your widescreen TVs. They were also interested in the increased ability for interactivity in terms of the capacity for charging you for things like individual programming through things like pay-per-view. Some even have gone so far as to say that with fiber and now wireless technologies in terms of the delivery of information, that we may see a shift economically from models where you pay indirectly for things like television programming through the purchase of goods and services from people who advertise on those channels and those networks. But increasingly, I think we'll find that we are going to be paying for more and more packets of information. We will pay ultimately for individual shows we like to download and watch. And that's all because of the higher speed interactivity afforded by, and the marriage, of course, with computers afforded by these networking developments. So I'm talking a little bit about how we're going to see this shifting of revenue models, and how we pay for programming and how we pay for information is in many ways directly the result of increasing capabilities to charge for those kinds of services by virtue of the increasing sophistication of the connections between program suppliers and program users. Well, you'll also read in this chapter how the whole notion of program supplier and program user is becoming increasingly fuzzy, because many of you are program suppliers when you upload your videos and your pictures. You'll read also in this chapter about how ARPANET came to be. That was essentially the networking precursor to the World Wide Web. This was a military development started in this country, and it was part of a defense system during the Cold War. And universities and defense sites essentially were interconnected by means of communications network technologies, initially AT&T long lines, but more increasingly sophisticated technologies as well. And the whole reason was essentially to protect the United States in the event of a nuclear holocaust. The idea of a network, if you can envision in your head for a moment a visual picture of the geography of the United States, the idea of the ARPANET was that if we had multiple nodes and networks, if we had a spider web spread out over this country, and each one of the points of connectivity in terms of that spider web was a defense center or an information center or a computer center at a university, that if part of the country was hit by nuclear bombs, the remaining part of the network would still function. And so the ARPANET was actually developed as part of the U.S. information defense system designed to withstand a nuclear holocaust, so that some members of the military and some members of government could continue to talk to each other. If you had a central point for information, if you had a central distribution point for command and control, and you hit that with a bomb, the thinking was in the Cold War, you would have wiped out all communications for the country. So the original idea of this vast network that started in the United States and then, of course, spread globally was all because of concerns about nuclear Armageddon during the Cold War. You'll also read in this chapter, and I've already talked a little bit about this, the shift from a unidirectional to multi-directional system in terms of what networking now provides us. Fiber technology, wireless technology, your wireless laptops, your handheld communications devices, you are now senders as well as receivers of more and more information. And this is shifting, of course, this idea of, say, a traditional network where you have one or more central distribution points. Think of NBC Radio back in the 20s and 30s, where they were essentially providing programming and sending it down wire to affiliate stations and affiliates to those networks across America. It was one way. It was unidirectional. And now, of course, with this two-way capacity and increasing bandwidth and more modern technologies, that one-way directionality has given way to multi-directional systems. You'll also read in this chapter about how all of this opens up new discussions about your privacy, about your information security, and about governmental controls. We have this notion, I think, in our heads that things like the World Wide Web are completely open. And in many countries, they are fairly wide open, including ours. But there are many governments in this land, in this globe. China's one of them. Iran is another one of them, that are very, very busy in their attempt to try to control the type of information that can come to people who live in that country. China, for example, has over 10,000 governmental employees who are in the business of monitoring web activity. And so anything that is deleterious or critical of the government in China is blocked. And the average individual in China does not have access to that information. Your own emails come and go, you may think, freely. Your texts may come and go freely. But every time I send email greetings to my friends in Germany, it is going through a screening process that involves American security filtration systems who are doing text analysis and analyzing all that traffic back and forth across the seas on the internet to make sure that I'm not engaged in some kind of terrorist activity. And so There are increasingly sophisticated networks, and along with increasingly sophisticated networks, there are also methods to detect and to invade your private communication. And there are ethical concerns about all that. And with certain freedoms come certain responsibilities. And with certain freedoms come certain risks. And we've all experienced in the last decade or so in this country concerns about what that might lead to. Freedom has a price. In terms of employment implications, when William Randolph Hearst began to provide a chain broadcast, provide chains for his newspapers, and was trading information back and forth between newspapers, he started to eliminate jobs in terms of local reporters because he could pump a lot of San Francisco content into a Sacramento paper or a Los Angeles paper. Okay, and that eliminated the need for local reporters. Or fewer local reporters. And so anytime there are these networking situations, particularly with regard to traditional and evolving media, and particularly entertainment media, there are implications in terms of potentially fewer and fewer jobs. You see this in local news all the time. You see this in television and in networks, and you of course have seen it vastly so in terms of things like newspapers and employment opportunities there. At the same time, people who are far thinking and who are looking at where things like media communication are headed, okay, and see opportunities where one could create consumer demand and can acquire content that might be important to people. There are always leveraged opportunities with the right amount of financing and some creativity to create something new that people want and that is ultimately profitable. I've had friends or former students do this, say, when cable was just beginning to grow, and they saw that people love sports. And so they went into venture capital with other people and bought up all the moving footage they could get their hands on that involved a motor that moved something around quickly around a track or on a body of water. And so they developed something called Speed Vision, which is a network channel, a cable network channel that made a lot of money for a lot of people. And that's because growing cable, the availability of traditional programming, and ways to distribute that programming and charge for it to an audience that would be interested. So with networking and expansion of networking, increasing developments of networking technology, there are opportunities. And for those of you out there who are far thinking about this, you might just be the next generation to really crack open wide a type of entertainment, a type of programming, a development in an area of media that my generation would never even think about. So there are some issues for you to consider. That's basically what I wanted to talk about in terms of Chapter 7. We'll get back to you in Chapter 8 soon, and I hope you have a good week. Thanks so much for watching.